He says there is a traitor in this room. Eleanor Hayes's voice rose from the far end of Blackthorn Hall, quiet but unmistakable, and every conversation died beneath the weight of it. At the long diplomatic table, Count Victor Orloff stood rigid beside the unsigned treaty, one gloved hand resting on the parchment as snow battered the tall windows behind him. No one had understood the Russian words he had spoken moments before. No one except the woman society had spent the evening pretending not to see. Eleanor stood beside a marble column in a plain gray gown, her fingers folded around the worn handkerchief that had belonged to her father. Only minutes earlier, Lady Beatrice Caldwell had laughed loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Miss Hayes is very accomplished," she had said, smiling behind her jeweled fan. "She can mend lace, pour tea, and make herself invisible at every ball in London." The gentleman near her had chuckled. Eleanor had lowered her eyes, not from shame, but from discipline. At 31, she had learned that cruelty often grew bored when denied a performance. Duke Alexander Whitmore had heard the remark from across the room. His steel-gray gaze had moved toward Eleanor for the briefest moment, unreadable beneath the candlelight, before duty called him back to the crisis unfolding at his table. His official translator had vanished somewhere along the northern road. The visiting delegation had arrived 2 days early, and before midnight, Blackthorn's only hope of securing trade for its frozen harbor would disappear. Count Orloff spoke again, sharper this time. The scholars surrounding Alexander exchanged helpless looks. One reached for a French dictionary. Another whispered that the Count was being deliberately difficult. Eleanor felt her father's handkerchief tighten in her palm. She had promised herself years ago that she would never again reveal what he had taught her. Languages had not saved Professor Samuel Hayes from disgrace. Knowledge had not kept his name from being dragged through drawing rooms by people who had never opened one of his books. Silence, Eleanor had discovered, was often the only shelter left to a ruined family. Then Orloff glanced toward his secretary and murmured a second sentence in Russian. Eleanor's breath caught. Alexander leaned over the treaty, unaware that the paper before him held more danger than any man in the room understood. She stepped forward. Her shoes made almost no sound against the polished floor, yet the entire hall seemed to feel her approach. "Your Grace," she said. Alexander turned. "Miss Hayes, the Count did not refuse your terms." Her voice remained calm. He accused someone in this room of changing them. A shadow moved across Alexander's face. Lady Beatrice gave a small, disbelieving laugh. Surely she cannot be serious. Eleanor looked directly at Count Orloff and spoke in fluent Russian, each word precise, elegant, and cold enough to still the room. The Count's anger vanished. His eyes widened. He answered her slowly, studying her as though she had stepped out of a memory. Then he asked a question that made the blood drain from her face. Alexander watched the exchange, his hand resting beside the treaty. What did he say? Eleanor could not answer at first. Count Orloff took one step closer and repeated the name in English. "Samuel Hayes." The hall fell silent once more. "You are his daughter." 3 days earlier, Eleanor Hayes had arrived at Blackthorn Hall beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, seated beside her aunt in a carriage that smelled of lavender, damp wool, and disapproval. Mrs. Margaret Caldwell had spent most of the 12-mile journey reminding Eleanor to remain useful and unnoticed. "Lady Beatrice has every reason to expect the Duke's attention," she said, adjusting the velvet ribbon at her throat. "You are here to assist her, not compete with her." Eleanor had looked through the frost-edged window at the dark pines bending beneath the wind. "I have never competed for a man's attention." "No," her aunt replied. "That has been rather obvious." The words landed softly, almost politely, which made them crueler. Eleanor did not answer. She had long ago learned that certain people mistook silence for surrender because they lacked the imagination to recognize restraint. Blackthorn Hall emerged through the falling snow like a fortress carved from winter itself, its stone towers rising above the white fields, its windows glowing gold against the gathering dusk. Inside, servants hurried through vaulted corridors carrying flowers, silver trays, and bundles of diplomatic correspondence. A foreign delegation was expected by the end of the week, and every room seemed to breathe with restrained urgency. Eleanor was given a narrow chamber in the west wing, while Lady Beatrice received a suite overlooking the gardens. Before Eleanor had removed her gloves, Her aunt placed a stack of invitations in her hands. Correct these. Beatrice says the French phrases look inelegant. Eleanor sat beside the small fire and examined the cards. The phrases were not merely inelegant. One of them transformed a formal welcome into an insult. She corrected each line without comment. Later that evening, while carrying the finished invitations to the library, she found Duke Alexander Whitmore standing alone beneath a brass chandelier, reading a letter marked with a foreign seal. He was taller than she had expected, dressed in black, with dark hair brushed away from a face made severe by exhaustion rather than vanity. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. "This sentence is wrong," Eleanor said before caution could silence her. Alexander looked up. "I beg your pardon." She indicated the final line. "The French suggest that you question the ambassador's honor. I believe you intend to question the reliability of the report." His gaze sharpened. "You read French?" "A little." It was a lie, and they both seemed to know it. He handed her the letter, then corrected. Eleanor took the page, crossed out 3 words, and replaced them with 5. Alexander read the revision twice. "Where did you learn this?" The fire shifted behind her, sending shadows across the shelves. She thought of her father's study, of winter mornings spent repeating verbs while he paced beneath walls crowded with maps, of the day his books were boxed after his disgrace. "From a man England chose to forget," she said. Something changed in Alexander's expression, but before he could ask more, Lady Beatrice entered in a sweep of blue silk. "There you are, Eleanor. I have been waiting 20 minutes. Her gaze dropped to the letter in Eleanor's hand. "Surely you are not troubling His Grace with one of your little corrections." Eleanor returned the page to Alexander. "The mistake is repaired." Beatrice smiled as though addressing a child. "How fortunate. Now come. My gown requires attention." Eleanor followed her from the library, leaving Alexander beside the fire with the corrected letter. He watched until the door closed. Then he looked again at the 5 precise words she had written, and at the faint initials impressed into the corner of her father's old handkerchief where it had brushed the page. S.H. For the first time in years, the name stirred a memory he could not immediately place. By morning, the snow had deepened to nearly 2 feet along the northern road, and Blackthorn Hall had become a house under siege by weather and expectation. Alexander stood in his study while his steward read the message for the 3rd time. The official translator's carriage had been found abandoned near Ashford Bridge, its horses taken to shelter by a farmer, but the man himself had not arrived at any inn within 20 miles. "The delegation is less than 6 hours away," Alexander said, "and the treaty must be settled by midnight tomorrow." His steward lowered the paper. "We have sent riders to every nearby town. The roads are closing." Alexander turned toward the window, where wind drove snow against the glass in pale, furious sheets. Beyond the frozen grounds lay Blackthorn Harbor, silent beneath winter fog. If the agreement failed, 3 merchant ships would turn south, taking coal contracts, grain orders, and months of wages with them. More than 800 families depended upon those docks. Society would call it a diplomatic embarrassment. Alexander knew it would mean empty kitchens. By noon, 3 scholars had been brought from neighboring estates. One spoke formal French. Another claimed knowledge of German. The third had spent 6 months in Vienna and considered himself prepared for any European negotiation. Their confidence lasted less than 10 minutes. A sealed letter from Count Orloff arrived in Russian, accompanied by a brief French note. The first scholar translated it as a request for hospitality. The second insisted it contained a warning. The third believed Orloff had insulted Alexander's ancestry. Eleanor stood near the sideboard arranging correspondence for Lady Beatrice and listened as the men argued over a single phrase. She recognized the problem immediately. The Russian sentence was an old diplomatic expression. It did not threaten Blackthorn. It warned that someone within the English party had already altered the proposed terms. Her fingers paused above the silver tray. "Miss Hayes," Lady Beatrice said from the settee, "the letters will not organize themselves." Eleanor continued sorting them. The safe choice was silence. Silence had kept food on her aunt's table and a roof above her head. Silence had protected what remained of her father's name from fresh ridicule. Yet each incorrect translation carried Alexander closer to disaster. The Duke entered the room with a second document in his hand. "Gentlemen, can any of you tell me whether Count Orloff is refusing the harbor clause?" The scholars exchanged guarded looks. The wording is unusually provincial, one said. Possibly hostile, offered another. Eleanor looked at the paper. One line had been rendered as, "The Northern Crown demands control of all harbor operations." The original meaning was different. The Northern Crown requests shared inspection during the winter shipping season. Control and inspection. One word could ruin an alliance. Alexander noticed her gaze. You disagree. It was not a question. Every face turned toward her. Beatrice gave a strained smile. Your Grace, Eleanor has a habit of collecting curious bits of knowledge. It does not make her a diplomat. No, Eleanor said softly. But the sentence still does not mean what they claim. The room chilled beyond the reach of the fire. Alexander held out the document. Then tell me what it means. Eleanor did not take it. She could feel her father's warning across the years. Knowledge is only dangerous when powerful men fear where it came from. Shared inspection, she said. Not control. And the earlier letter warns that someone has changed the English terms before they reached Count Orloff. The scholars protested at once. Alexander raised one hand, and the room fell quiet. His eyes remained on Eleanor. How certain are you? Completely. Before he could respond, the great clock in the entrance hall struck one. A servant hurried through the door, breathless from the cold. Your Grace, the Russian delegation has crossed the eastern gate. Alexander looked toward the snow-darkened windows. They were not expected until evening. The servant swallowed. Count Orloff says he will speak only in his own language, and he demands to see the treaty immediately. The Russian delegation entered Blackthorn Hall beneath a gust of snow and silence. Count Victor Orloff removed his gloves without haste, his silver-streaked hair damp from the storm, his expression carved into the calm severity of a man who had crossed hundreds of miles expecting deception. Behind him came two advisors, a secretary carrying a locked leather case, and four servants bearing documents sealed in dark red wax. Alexander received them at the foot of the great staircase, every inch the composed duke, though the strain behind his eyes had sharpened since morning. Count Orloff, he said in French, Blackthorn welcomes you. Orloff answered in Russian. The scholars shifted uneasily. One attempted a translation, stumbled over the second sentence, and stopped. Orloff's gaze hardened. He turned to his secretary and spoke again, more quietly this time. Eleanor, standing beside her aunt near the far wall, understood every word. He believes we have insulted him, she thought. Worse, he believes it was deliberate. Alexander motioned toward the council chamber, but Orloff did not move. Instead, he opened the leather case and withdrew 2 copies of the treaty. He placed them on the long table beneath the chandeliers, one in Russian and one in English, then pointed to a paragraph near the final page. His voice rose. The first scholar translated only fragments. He says the harbor belongs to his crown. No, Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Every face turned. Lady Beatrice's fan froze in midair. Eleanor stepped forward, her pulse steady despite the heat gathering beneath her collar. He says the English document grants his crown permanent authority over the harbor, while the Russian document allows only temporary winter inspections. Orloff looked at her sharply. He addressed her in Russian, testing the shape of each word. Eleanor answered in the same language. His advisors exchanged glances. He switched to French. She replied without hesitation. German followed, then Italian, then Spanish, each transition smooth as the turning of a key within a lock. The hall became utterly still. Men who had dismissed her as a dependent relative now watched as 5 languages passed between Eleanor and the foreign count with measured precision. Lady Beatrice recovered first. This is a charming performance, she said, her smile thin. But speaking prettily is not the same as understanding affairs of state. Eleanor turned toward her. No, understanding affairs of state requires listening before deciding who is permitted to speak. Beatrice's cheeks lost their color. Alexander concealed the briefest flicker of approval. Orloff placed one finger on the disputed paragraph and asked Eleanor a final question. She read both versions carefully. The English wording was elegant, almost flawless. That made the deception more dangerous. The change was intentional, she said. Someone replaced temporary access with permanent authority and altered the inspection boundaries from 3 miles of coastline to the entire Blackthorn Harbor district. A murmur moved through the room. Alexander's expression became still. Can you prove it? Eleanor traced the seals, dates, and signatures. Then she found a faint mark beside the altered clause, no larger than a grain of rice. Her breath caught. It was a scholar's cipher, one she had seen hundreds of times in her father's study. Orloff watched her face. "You recognize it," he said in English. Eleanor looked up. "I recognize the method." Alexander pulled out the chair beside his own. "Miss Hayes, sit." She remained standing. "As your curiosity, your grace, or as your equal at this table?" The question struck the room harder than any accusation. Alexander met her gaze without offense. Then he inclined his head. "As the only person here who can tell me which version will save Blackthorn." Eleanor sat. Orloff opened the treaty before her, and beneath the trembling candlelight, the mark beside the altered clause formed two familiar initials. S.H. For one terrible moment, Eleanor could hear nothing but the fire shifting in the hearth and the slow ticking of the clock above the council chamber door. The initials beside the altered clause were unmistakable. Samuel Hayes had marked his private notes that way for as long as she could remember, pressing the letters together with a narrow diagonal stroke that no ordinary clerk would have thought to imitate. Count Orloff watched her carefully. "Your father used that cipher in diplomatic work," he said. Eleanor kept her hand flat against the table so no one would see it tremble. "My father was accused of corrupting diplomatic work." One of Alexander's advisers leaned forward. "Then perhaps this proves the accusation was deserved." The words moved through the chamber like cold air beneath a locked door. Lady Beatrice lowered her fan, her expression brightening with the cruel satisfaction of someone who believed the evening had finally returned to its proper order. "How unfortunate," she murmured. "We appear to have placed the fate of Blackthorn in the hands of a traitor's daughter." Alexander rose. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You will not speak of Miss Hayes in that manner while seated at my table." Beatrice looked away first. Eleanor should have felt protected. Instead, she felt the old weight of shame pressing against her chest, a burden placed there years ago by strangers who had never known her father. She bent closer to the treaty. The cipher was familiar, but something about it was wrong. The diagonal stroke leaned left. Her father's hand had always leaned right. "This is not his mark," she said. The advisor gave a dismissive laugh. "You just said it was unmistakable. The method is his. The hand is not." Eleanor reached for the Russian copy and examined the margins. Beneath the altered paragraph, she found three symbols embedded within the flourishes of the script. They appeared decorative, but Samuel Hayes had taught her that diplomacy often hid its sharpest truths inside ornament. She translated the symbols silently. Northern Passage, military protection, open authority. Her breath grew shallow. "This agreement does more than surrender the harbor." Alexander turned toward her. "Explain." Eleanor placed the two documents side by side. The English version grants permanent authority over Blackthorn Harbor. The coded instruction beneath it permits foreign troops to enter the district whenever trade is declared unstable. Instability is not defined. Count Orloff's face hardened. "My government approved no such condition." Then someone intends both nations to sign a document neither fully understands. Alexander looked toward the windows, beyond which 800 families lived beneath the shadow of his decisions. "A hidden occupation," he said. "Disguised as commercial protection," Eleanor replied. The room erupted into argument. Orloff's advisers accused the English council. Alexander's scholars blamed foreign agents. Lady Beatrice demanded that Eleanor be removed until her family's involvement could be investigated. Through it all, Eleanor studied the cipher. Her father had once used the same pattern in letters written during his final year, when his name had already begun to crumble. Perhaps he had not created the trap. Perhaps he had discovered it. Alexander struck the table once with his palm, and silence returned. "No one leaves this house," he said, "and no document leaves this room." One advisor rose in protest. Alexander's gaze stopped him. "The roads are sealed by snow, the treaty has been altered, and the only person who recognized it has been insulted twice in my presence. That ends now." He closed the council chamber doors himself. Then he looked at Eleanor, not as a curiosity, not as a dependent woman who had spoken beyond her station, but as the only mind he trusted in a room filled with titles. "Tell me what you need." Eleanor touched the false initials. "My father's papers." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "And the truth about why he died disgraced." Alexander ordered the library sealed before the second hand of the great clock completed its next circle. Outside, the storm pressed against Blackthorn Hall with a low, unbroken moan, whitening the windows until the world beyond them disappeared. Inside, Eleanor stood before a long oak table while servants carried in 3 dust-covered boxes from the West Archive. Each bore the name Samuel Hayes in faded black ink. She had not seen them since the winter after her father's disgrace. "These were sent here?" she asked. "Your father corresponded with my grandfather," Alexander said. "The papers were placed under ducal protection after the inquiry. I did not know they remained." Eleanor lifted the lid of the first box. The scent of old paper, sealing wax, and cedar rose like a memory. For an instant she was 10 years old again, seated beside her father while rain tapped against the study glass and 5 dictionaries lay open between them. He had taught her that every language possessed 2 meanings, the one spoken aloud and the one protected by silence. Alexander dismissed the servants. Count Orloff remained with his secretary in the adjoining chamber, examining the official seals. Only Sir Jonathan Reed, Alexander's senior advisor, stayed near the fire, his silver watch chain bright against his dark waistcoat. "This investigation concerns the council," Jonathan said. "Miss Hayes should not be permitted to handle classified papers without supervision." Eleanor glanced at him. His tone was courteous. His eyes were not. Alexander closed the library door. "She has my supervision." They worked beneath the trembling light of 6 candles. Eleanor sorted letters by language and date, translating French dispatches, German shipping records, and Russian memoranda written in her father's narrow hand. Alexander read beside her, asking few questions and remembering every answer. Near midnight, Eleanor found the letter that had ruined Samuel Hayes. It warned that a trade agreement contained concealed military authority. The inquiry had declared the warning false and accused him of forging evidence to embarrass the crown. Beneath the final paragraph, however, lay a sequence of Italian words that appeared meaningless. Eleanor whispered them aloud. Alexander leaned closer, his shoulder nearly touching hers. "What is it?" "Not Italian," she said. "A substitution code disguised as Italian." She reached for her father's pocket dictionary, still tucked inside the box. The pages opened naturally to a pressed sprig of rosemary. Beside it, Samuel had written a single instruction: "Read what remains when honor is removed." Eleanor crossed out every word connected to rank, title, and courtesy. A sentence emerged from the fragments. "The altered treaty was prepared inside Blackthorn. The proof is carried by the man who measures every hour but never arrives on time." Alexander read the line twice. Across the room, Sir Jonathan's fingers closed around his pocket watch. The movement was slight. Eleanor still saw it. Alexander did too. Jonathan smiled. "A poetic accusation from a disgraced man proves nothing." Eleanor turned another page and found a drawing of the same watch, its crest copied with exacting care. The symbol beneath it matched the false cipher on the treaty. Alexander's voice became quiet. "How long have you carried that watch, Jonathan?" "It belonged to my father." "Your father served on the inquiry against Samuel Hayes." Silence gathered between them. Jonathan stepped away from the fire. Eleanor looked down at her father's final coded letter and understood the truth that had waited years to be heard. Samuel Hayes had not betrayed his country. He had discovered a betrayal within Blackthorn, and the men responsible had buried his name to protect their own. Alexander reached toward her, then stopped before touching her hand. "You were right," he said. Eleanor's eyes remained on the letter. Being right did not save him. No, his voice carried no defense. But it may restore him. At that moment, the library door opened. A servant stood on the threshold, pale with alarm. "Your Grace, Count Orloff's sealed treaty is missing." Eleanor turned toward the fire. Sir Jonathan Reed was gone, and the narrow door behind the bookcase stood open. The hidden passage behind the bookcase opened into a narrow stone corridor that descended toward the eastern wing. Alexander took a lantern from the wall and moved first, Eleanor close behind him, while 2 trusted footmen followed at a distance. The air smelled of dust, cold iron, and extinguished candles. No one spoke. Every sound seemed too loud beneath the weight of what had been discovered. The corridor ended beside an unused morning room, where the outer door stood ajar and snow blew across the floor in thin white ribbons. Sir Jonathan Reed was gone. So was the treaty. On a small writing desk, however, lay a folded sheet bearing Eleanor's name. Alexander reached for it, but she stopped him. Let me. The letter was written in Russian. Its wording accused Eleanor of arranging the theft in exchange for a position within Count Orloff's court. Beneath the accusation appeared her signature, imitated with unsettling care. A second page contained fragments copied from her father's coded letters. He prepared this before tonight, she said. Alexander's jaw tightened. He intended to use your father's name against you from the beginning. Footsteps approached from the hall. Lady Beatrice entered with 3 members of the council and Count Orloff's secretary behind her. Her gaze moved from the open passage to the letter in Eleanor's hand. How convenient, she said. The treaty disappears, and Miss Hayes is found beside a secret corridor with foreign correspondence. Alexander turned toward her. You entered a restricted wing without permission. Because I was told a traitor was escaping. Beatrice lifted her chin. Perhaps the wrong one has. The councilman demanded to see the letter. Within minutes, the morning room filled with suspicion. The Russian secretary confirmed that the language was accurate. One advisor insisted Eleanor be confined until the treaty was recovered. Another reminded Alexander that Samuel Hayes had once faced the same accusations. Eleanor watched the doubt move through the room, familiar and swift, attaching itself to her name before truth had time to speak. Then she looked at Alexander. He said nothing, only for a moment, only long enough to consider the consequences. Yet Eleanor felt that silence more deeply than every insult Lady Beatrice had offered. Alexander had defended her before strangers. Now, when belief required risk, he hesitated. Eleanor removed the small silver badge he had given her at the council table and placed it upon the desk. I will finish the translation if the treaty is found, she said. But I will not remain here while my honesty is measured against the comfort of your reputation. Alexander stepped toward her. Eleanor. It was the first time he had spoken her name without formality. She met his eyes. My father spent his final years waiting for powerful men to decide that truth mattered more than appearances. I will not spend mine doing the same. Outside, the storm rattled the windows. Eleanor drew her cloak from the chair and walked from the room before anyone could mistake her departure for surrender. Alexander followed her into the entrance hall. The roads are impassable. The keeper's cottage is less than a mile from the south gate. You cannot go alone. I have been alone in rooms filled with people for years, Your Grace. The word stopped him. Eleanor opened the great door, and winter swept around her in a burst of white. She stepped into the storm without looking back. Behind her, Alexander returned to the morning room and lifted the forged letter beneath the lantern. The signature was nearly perfect. The ink was not. A faint blue sheen ran through every stroke, the same rare Prussian ink kept in only one place at Blackthorn Hall. Sir Jonathan's private study. The keeper's cottage stood less than a mile from Blackthorn Hall, but the storm made the distance feel endless. Snow pressed against Eleanor's cloak, erased the path beneath her boots, and turned the lantern at the south gate into a dim gold star behind her. She kept walking. Pride gave her the first 100 yards. Anger carried her farther. After that, only memory remained. Her father had once told her that truth was rarely powerful at first. At first, it was only lonely. The cottage appeared through the white darkness, its chimney bent beneath the wind. Eleanor reached the door and found it unlocked. Inside, the hearth was cold, but a lamp burned on the table. Beside it lay Count Orloff's missing treaty. Eleanor stopped. The silence changed. You were always more observant than they deserved, Sir Jonathan Reed said from the shadows near the window. He stepped into the lamplight with his coat fastened and his silver watch in one hand. His expression held no panic, only weary calculation. Your father was the same. Eleanor did not move toward the treaty. You framed him. My father did. I merely inherited the consequences. Jonathan opened the watch. Inside the lid was the crest Samuel Hayes had drawn in his final letter. The agreement was meant to create dependence, not war. Blackthorn would lose control slowly. No scandal. No public resistance. Your father refused to understand the elegance of it. Eleanor's voice remained steady. He understood it perfectly. That is why you needed him silenced. Jonathan looked toward the fireplace, where kindling and oil had already been prepared. The original treaty cannot survive the night. Neither can your accusations. He reached for the lamp. Eleanor spoke in German, loudly and urgently, ordering imaginary guards outside to surround the cottage. Jonathan froze. She continued, changing to Russian, calling for the rear entrance to be secured. Wind struck the walls. From beyond the door came the faint sound of horses. Jonathan's face tightened. Eleanor seized the treaty and moved away from the table just as the door opened. Alexander entered with 2 footmen and Count Orloff behind him, snow clinging to their shoulders. His gaze found Eleanor first. Only after seeing her unharmed did he look at Jonathan. Step away from the fire. Jonathan gave a thin smile. You arrived too late. He swept the lamp from the table. Oil spilled across the kindling, and flame rose in a sudden bright sheet. No one was injured, but the treaty caught at one corner before Eleanor could pull it free. Alexander smothered the burning pages beneath his cloak. When he lifted it, half the document had blackened into curling fragments. Count Orloff stared at the ruined clauses. Without the original wording, there can be no agreement. Jonathan's smile returned. Eleanor looked at the destroyed pages, then closed her eyes. She had read the treaty once at the council table, once in the library, and once beside the lamp in the cottage. Her father had trained her memory by making her translate entire passages without looking back. She began in Russian. Her voice was low at first, then certain. Clause by clause, she recited every surviving and lost line. She repeated the trade boundaries, the winter inspection terms, the harbor protections, and the concealed military authority. Then she spoke the English version, preserving each alteration exactly. Count Orloff's secretary wrote as quickly as his hand allowed. Alexander did not interrupt. Neither did the storm. By the time Eleanor finished, Jonathan's expression had emptied of confidence. The 2 versions stood restored through her memory alone, and every false word pointed back to the man holding the silver watch. Alexander turned to his footmen. Take Sir Jonathan to the west chamber and place him under guard. Then he faced Eleanor. I doubted you. She met his eyes across the dying fire. Yes. There is no defense for it. No, his voice softened. Then I will not offer one. Count Orloff lifted the reconstructed treaty. Miss Hayes has saved this negotiation. Eleanor looked at the blackened pages beneath Alexander's cloak. No, the truth survived. I merely remembered where it was hidden. By dawn, the storm had weakened to a pale curtain of snow, and Blackthorn Hall no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like a place waiting for judgment. In the council chamber, the reconstructed treaty lay beside the blackened remains of the original, every clause restored through Eleanor's memory and verified by Count Orloff's secretary. Sir Jonathan Reed remained under guard in the West Wing, and the documents recovered from his study proved that Samuel Hayes had warned the Crown years earlier about the same hidden scheme. The evidence was clear. Eleanor's father had not betrayed his country. He had tried to protect it. Alexander stood at the head of the long table while the council gathered in silence. Let the record show, he said, that Professor Samuel Hayes was falsely accused, that his work was altered, and that his name will be formally restored. Eleanor did not lower her eyes. She had imagined those words for years, yet hearing them brought no triumph. Only a quiet release, like a locked window opening after a long winter. Count Orloff signed the corrected agreement first. Alexander signed beside him. The terms protected Blackthorn Harbor, preserved local authority, and secured trade for the 800 families who depended upon it. When the final seal was pressed into wax, no one applauded. The moment was too solemn for celebration. Lady Beatrice broke the silence. How fortunate for Miss Hayes, she said. A ruined name repaired, a place at a duke's table, and all because his grace chose to notice her. Alexander turned, but Eleanor rose before he could speak. Her gray gown carried no jewels, and her father's handkerchief remained folded in her palm. Still, every person in the chamber watched her. No man made me worthy, she said. One man merely learned to see what was already there. Beatrice's fan closed with a soft snap. She offered no reply. Later that afternoon, a royal messenger arrived with an invitation for Eleanor to join the Crown's diplomatic office in London. Alexander offered her a second position as Blackthorn's chief linguistic advisor, with independent authority over all foreign correspondence. Eleanor accepted both on her own terms. She would divide her time between London and Blackthorn. Her salary would be her own. Her work would bear her name. That evening, Alexander found her in the library beside the boxes of her father's papers. No counsel waited. No witnesses stood nearby. He carried no ring. "I owe you an apology without explanation," he said. "I hesitated when you needed trust, and hesitation can wound as deeply as accusation." Eleanor closed the letter in her hand. "You cannot change that moment." "No, but I can allow it to change me." He looked toward the shelves where Samuel Hayes's work would soon be cataloged and returned to honor. "Blackthorn needs you, but that is not why I came." Eleanor waited. "I came because when you left, this house became exactly what it had been before you spoke. Impressive, orderly, empty." The words were simple, stripped of command. "I will not ask you to become smaller, so I may feel greater. I will not ask you to remain silent, so I may appear wise. I ask only for the chance to become a man worthy of standing beside you." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "You may begin by waiting." Alexander almost smiled. "How long?" "Until I am certain you understand that love is not another treaty to be secured." Months later, beneath the same chandelier where society had once laughed at her, Alexander asked again. This time he spoke in French, German, Italian, Spanish, and carefully practiced Russian. His pronunciation was imperfect. His meaning was not. Eleanor listened, then answered in English. "Yes. Some women are not rejected because they lack worth. They are rejected because lesser hearts fear what they cannot equal."